there's a whole bunch of us that ship energy down to the U.S., and we have to maximize it. And then we have to remember the 4.3 million barrels of oil that's coming from Alberta. As Premier Smith said on our comments, I think over the last couple of days, she has the Trump card. Well, a message to Premier Smith, one day I think you might have to use that Trump card and give approval for an export tax. Because you want to talk about a Trump card, that will instantly change the game.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford laying down the gauntlet despite a month-long reprieve, announced last week for Donald Trump's tariffs, or part of them. Ford is adding a 25% export tax to electricity headed south. He says as long as the threat of any tariffs persists. As you heard there, he's also sending a message to Alberta's Premier, Danielle Smith, who last week told us there's no way she'd do the same thing with Alberta's energy exports to the U.S. Take a listen.
Actually, there's no circumstance under which I would agree to another tax on Alberta that takes $40 billion out of Alberta. You can ask me as much as you like. The answer is no.
Let's bring back the front bench to talk about that. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, and Kathleen Munn. Kathleen, I'll start with you this time. I thought it was interesting that Doug Ford said what he did about Danielle Smith in that press. Like, the whole press conference was obviously about adding this export tax. BC's open to it. Clearly, Alberta and Saskatchewan are not. But for him, and he went on to say, to be fair to him, you know, it's her decision. I mean, the feds will ultimately make that decision, but it's hers. It's her province. But just the fact that he name dropped Danielle Smith, the premier, and in the way he did, what do you take from that?
A couple things. He's really trying to position himself as Captain Canada, the leader, and he wants the other premiers to backdraft behind him. He's like, I am driving this issue. He's been driving it from the get-go in terms of his advertising campaign, triggering his own election in Ontario where it was dominating, and he wants them to fall in line. And I noted Premier Eby in the last segment, Premier Wabkinew as well. They've been all doing that kind of stuff. Danielle Smith has kind of refused to toe the line, and I think he's saying, you gotta come on behind us now. As the head of the Council Federation right now, he has a bit more of a podium to do that, and he's trying to pull her into kind of getting her into a corner to kind of get her to toe the line.
My impression from doing that interview last week is that's not going to happen. Shakir, I asked, I think 3 or 4 times, if in fact, given the amount of leverage Danielle Smith has, and if there was a promise from Ottawa to make Albertans whole, like, would that be something she'd consider? Her answer was essentially that Albertans, and she in particular, would not trust the federal government in an arrangement like that. Do you think there will be any movement on that front, or are we headed for a more pronounced kind of disagreement between those two factions?
I think if tariffs actually come into play, I think Danielle Smith might reconsider her position. I think what Ford is asking right now is just put the option on the table. I think you're seeing with things like electricity in Ontario, it's getting Americans' attention. Like, in the media, they're talking about it. Americans are talking about that. And I think that's what Ford wants to have happen. Make sure that you can put these things on the table so that American conservatives are saying that, you know, this is going to be disastrous. Why is Trump putting these tariffs in place? And communicate that to the White House and hopefully get some reprieve from the tariffs over a longer-term period. But I think completely taking it off the table is what Doug Ford doesn't really want to see happen.
What do you think that means for premiers, for example, later this week? They're likely going to meet with the new Prime Minister-designate Mark Carney. And how much of a challenge does it end up being for Carney, who ultimately will have to make a call between those two factions?
Well, look,
maybe.
I think since Trump dropped the threat of across-the-board tariffs from being implemented, I mean, the threat still exists, but the implementation was paused. Since that happened, there's been a lot of unity on this side of the border. And we heard it from Mark Carney last night that we're going to still hold our retaliation in place. Premier Ford moved ahead with the electricity tariffs today. I think that was smart politics and a good pressure tactic, to Shakir's point. There's been a consensus that we need to continue to hold the line to show strength during this pause period. Danielle Smith is the outlier on that. And I think that's what Doug Ford was trying to talk about today and expose today. Mark Carney's been now very clear. Canada is going to continue to stand in a position of strength. We're going to continue to keep our retaliation in place in order to keep our hands strong in whatever negotiation comes up. But the reality is it's going to be difficult, I think, to pressure Danielle Smith into a different position. She's really not looking like she's going to bend on this. You put it pretty clearly to her last week. And I think it's going to be hard for her to move unless there's a change in the dynamics of the tariff situation, to Shakir's point, and they're actually introduced in a way that causes a reaction. The only other input would be politically, right? As I said, I think Doug Ford's action today was largely driven by politics, right? It's largely performance, and I think it's very good political performance. If Danielle Smith starts to get in a position where people in her province are saying, why aren't you acting? Premiers across the country are acting. They're looking, at the very least, like they're putting a great deal of pressure on the Americans. Why aren't you doing something about it? I think she's going to end up in an increasingly difficult position with her caucus, which, notoriously, United Conservative Party caucus challenges are a pretty regular problem.
Well, she already has a few on her hands on
Exactly.
different subjects.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Just to be fair to her, though, I think last week I felt as though, and certainly in that interview, that she was more definitive on everything beyond that one thing. So she did announce taking the booze away and not stop buying American, just like other provinces. Yeah. She was supportive of everything the federal government did so far in their counter tariff response, and she was explicit about that. But to Dan's point and Shakir's point, the one thing that she won't bend on is around keeping that option even on the table.
Yeah, and she was stronger in your interview with her last week about actually even condemning the Trump government, kind of saying that this is bad, they shouldn't be doing that, where before she was kind of a little bit warmer in tones to the Republicans and to President Trump herself. So that was significant. But what she said, or what I took away from the interview last week, was just that I don't trust the federal government in any way if they were to put a tax on it to actually deliver that money back to Albertans. I don't trust them. I don't want to give it to them, end of story. But what you're seeing actually is the other premiers being like, we can do this stuff even without the federal government. Premier Eby today was asked, does this matter that there's kind of quote unquote chaos in Ottawa, that we're going to have a change in government, we're possibly going into an election? He's like, no, we are driving the legislation in our home province of BC. We can implement all these changes and impact what's happening in Alaska, the Republican governor there, by just doing the things that we need to do in our province.
And I think that seems to be what Doug Ford is doing too. The thing is, when Danielle Smith says oil and gas are our trump card, they are. 60% of what the United States takes in as far as crude oil imports comes from this country. So if, as you point out, Shakir, the tariffs start coming, the economic pain starts really being felt, if in fact any of these threats actually materialize in the way that Donald Trump is saying that they will, it's hard to imagine a world in which the federal government is not at least facing the question of whether or not they need to override that and do it without her consent.
Right, and impose it on Alberta.
Yeah.
I think overall, though, listen, I think Danielle Smith has some ground to stand on when she's like, I don't trust the federal government. Oil and gas is demonized in this country. The Liberals have done nothing to help that province, help move this
pipeline.
The Liberal government, all of a sudden, everybody's just pro-resource development. But for the last 10 years, there haven't been many people who have been pro-resource development, and now they want to tell her what to do with the resource in her province. I do see where she's coming from. Also there's this notion of Canadian unity. I get that. Be on board. You have the most, the dominant resource here that can really hurt the Americans. But I understand where she's coming from. I think we need to be fair to her as well. We haven't been as supportive of her province and their resource over these last 10 years.
Well, it's why I think it will be such a unique, if it ends up materializing in that way, a unique challenge for Mark Carney, right?
Absolutely.
First couple of weeks on the job, you got to make a call like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll be hard for him to get through a campaign, should there be one, without making a comment on that or a commitment on that, right? He's going to have to answer that question. And I wonder to what extent Danielle Smith thinks she's going to just try and force him to be the one to make the call on this as opposed to having to do it herself. Kathleen's right. The provincial premiers in every other jurisdiction are leading on this issue. I think, as I said, it's good politics. That's part of why they're doing that. But I think she's probably trying to put Mark Carney in a position where he has to use that trump card and he has to be the one to implement it so she doesn't get held accountable for it. And that's not good for the country, right? I understand what you're saying about resource development and how Albertans feel the rest of Canada views that sector. But I think failing to use this tool that we have, 60% of American oil comes from this country, failing to use that tool and forcing the federal government to create division around it is just as bad for this country.
Okay, well, on that positive note, we'll leave our discussion. Guys, thank you so much for coming in. It's such a pleasure to have you here in person. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, and Kathleen Monk.